All right, welcome to Hyper Live, and today's episode is Enterprise Analytics and AI. Are you asking the right questions? And special guest today, welcome Brian Lambert from the US, author of The AI Lead. Brian, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hey, Brian Lambert here, and so glad to be on the show with you guys. I've enjoyed listening to your shows, and I love the conversations. So my focus is on helping people be successful, and that means a lot of different things at this time of really evolution. Really, my focus is on blending technology with human capability. And I do that in a lot of different ways, from helping people develop and deploy products to rethinking their processes, to learning how to code and bring software to market differently, how to leverage AI as an enablement tool and a thought partner, and also as somebody who's really been at the intersection of a lot of different professions, really leaning into the idea here that it's time to be creative and get outside of our silos and our specialties that we have to really think differently and be creative at a time like this. So I'm glad to be here and look forward to our discussion today.
Yeah, sounds like some exciting stuff to talk about. And Daniel, co-host.
Yeah, welcome to the show, Brian. Yes, I'm Daniel Walters. So I'm a CTO coach and an advisor. My business is Great CTO, and I've done a lot of work with the Hyper team over the years. So for those of you watching the show, support the show by liking us on YouTube and LinkedIn. So yeah, let's get into it, Gareth.
Yeah, great. Maybe Brian, would you like to start and just what drew you to working with AI and authoring your book, and any particular sort of aha moments for you in terms of how thinking about how data and AI can fundamentally change how businesses operate.
Yeah, thanks. I think for me, it was 2012-ish timeframe. I can't remember the exact date. I should have looked it up, but there was this article I came across, and it was really intriguing to me. I had done some dabbling in machine learning and understanding and actually being in the buyer seat of thinking about buying machine learning as a thing. And I remember going, well, that's great. It can crunch numbers, but I don't know if we have the data for that. And then came across an article about this new company that this guy Elon Musk was part of, and they were talking about this idea that you could actually engage with a system that was beyond machine learning, and it would respond back. and I was really intrigued by that, and started exploring that. And fast forward to today, we now know that whole field as the idea of generative AI and the AI space and chatbots and ChatGPT and OpenAI, are here. And so it was really an interesting moment, because as somebody in the space of change and also, more importantly, trying to improve myself and trying to learn, I'm a continuous learner, and I like to put myself out there and just try new things. I really was intrigued by the concept of engaging with something that could engage back, and so that's what kind of intrigued me. But when a ChatGPT launched, I remembered that first couple of weeks it was tough, because the more I played with it, the more I realized it was definitely smarter than me. and I think I was early to embrace that, and had to walk around the block a few times, coming to grips with the fact that perhaps my expertise and the things that I thought that I made me valuable, I had to rethink those things. And so as I, sought it around and woe is me for a couple of weeks about the future, I decided to to think about what it could do from a positive angle and figure out how to skate to the puck. And that meant I had a lot to learn around how these things work. And so that's been a 4-year journey that actually became the book, the AI Lead book. That's how I went about learning and approaching my learning journey. And I just wrote down all the stuff I did to try to figure that out. And now I'm in the space of bringing enterprise software to market. I'm in the space of vibe coding myself, building applications in 90 days or less to see if I could do it, and also to see if it could help people around me, and then also trying to build with a team, offshore folks, and thinking about the idea that our applications today are not necessarily straight up CRUD applications where you fill out and hit enter. They actually can think with you and do things for you. And that's a whole different paradigm to a lot of coders. And so I find myself right back in the space of, as Marshall Goldsmith says, what got you here isn't going to get you there. And it seems to be where I've lived for 20 years.
Yep, I know. Well, we both know that space very well, and it's it's an exciting space. I think it's a pretty exciting time to be involved in technology, actually. And just tell us a little bit more about the book. What were some of the main themes that came out? I know you've got this lovely phrase, data drag, and maybe that sort of hints at some of the challenges organizations might be facing to adopt some of these new approaches. But yeah, tell us a little bit more about the book.
Yeah, absolutely. So in that learning journey, I came to the conclusion that having the chatbot in your phone is amazing, and as consumers, TikTok or YouTube or whatever, that it's really going to help people do their homework and things. I think I realized that pretty early. But then I asked myself, well, what's it going to do to the enterprise? What's it going to do to large organizations? And how is this likely going to play out? And it really didn't take me very long to come to the point of view that AI is only really as successful as the data that it has. No data, no AI. And these tools that it came out, 3 or 4 years ago, their data source was the whole internet. So when you think about it that way, as a salesperson, somebody who's been in that role for a long time, when everybody has the same product and the same product knowledge, they all start sounding alike. So I figured that was going to go for maybe three years or so, and then companies are going to start wondering how to be different and how to be valuable in new ways, which means they have to think about their proprietary resources and the data that they have between their, in their firewall. And I didn't know what it would be called at the time. The book I started writing was around the concept of what I called enterprise AI. And it was on the idea that you really have to have a foundation of 3 things. Obviously it's people, process, and technology, and all of that's going to change, but it's more importantly about the data and information and the leveraging of it. And with generative AI and chatbots, quote unquote, the ability to leverage that becomes that now we know as context, and that helps you move things forward. So that is the concept of it's enterprise AI. It's leveraging data and information. I talk about overcoming data drag. It's the drag that holds you back. It's the unknown data, the lack of data, the lack of process, the lack of information that AI can't necessarily just fix for you. And then it's also the idea in the book of overcoming that data drag with a speed layer that brings together data, ingesting that data, doing something with it, which is a generative kind of capability. But all of that's built on the ability to get it in there. So you have to clean it. You have to keep it relevant, contextual, and then also, more importantly, enrich it with the right information, which means you have to close the loop back on the data. So I get into all of that in an enterprise architecture and what that would look like. So it's a lot of mental models, a lot of frameworks and tools to think it through. And I outlined some of the basic technologies that were just at the time coming out, but those technologies are still fundamental to now what is the AI age. And the
It
last
sounds like
mile of all that, and the thing that we can probably sink our teeth into a little bit today, is that last mile of all that, of what I just said, is this idea of visualization and experiencing these tools and being able to take action on it. So it's one thing to have a chat bot and hit enter. It's quite another thing to have something come back.
Mm.
And that's the big I mean, where were you when you first got a response back, and then what did you think, right? And I remember the moment, and I think people still have it today, which when they go into the system, it's like, well, what do I do? And so that drag, that hesitation, the opposite of that is getting that response back and then taking action on it. And that's where I'm really intrigued by this idea that it's about the last mile and the experience that people get, but more importantly, the information that they have, so that they can act. And that's to me the great elixir today of a lot of risk, a lot of fear, a lot of challenges, a lot of finding and pointing out what doesn't work, what doesn't necessarily look good, what all the risks of AI, all the risks of doing these, all the negatives. And the opposite of that is thinking about and leaning into, what if you're not the smartest person in the room? What if there's something at your fingertips that could actually pass the legal bar exams and pass the genius level tests and medical tests and everything else, and you had that at your fingertips, what would you do with that?
Yeah, it's a fascinating question. Yeah.
Mhm.
And but well, before we dig into the last mile, maybe just tell us, what are you seeing with organizations in terms of data drag? What challenges are they facing at the moment? And whereabouts on the curve are organizations that you're working with?
Yeah, I think so interesting. Data is like air. Nobody really owns it, and everybody complains when they don't have it. It's not comfortable. So, but it's kind of like everybody's responsibility, therefore it's nobody's. So I'm not an advocate of like, hey, data has to be owned by somebody in order to fix it. But if you look at it as a capability and building a contextual capability that leverages your own proprietary information, there's a lot of value in that, and that value needs to be unlocked. So what organizations really struggle with today is not necessarily the technology. I can tell you without any hesitation that the technology to do amazing things is right there. I mean, the
Yeah.
technology is there. It is amazing what it can do. The issue is the processes and the information are not there, and the people's mindset are not there. So when you don't have the mindset, you don't have the information, you don't have process to automate, you end up with a great tool in the garage sitting there, and that's what's happening. And also, organizations want to go after the big bang and deploy 12,000 agents to do things, but like, what are they doing, and what's the value of that? And that's the big unknown for most people. So what I can also say without hesitation is pretty much everybody's got shadow AI happening, just like shadow IT. The idea that
Mhm.
nobody's using AI right now is absolutely ridiculous. The fact that most people inside of an organization are to me, they're definitely using it in an organization, even though they'll say they're not. They are. It's just like shadow IT. And it's one of those things where how much is getting uploaded and training these models, because companies haven't necessarily provided that support internally. And so that's where I think the biggest challenges are, is what is it and how are we going to go about it? And when executives have all the money and they want to spend the money, they're going to talk about strategy and they're going to talk about transformation. Well, the biggest impact of AI today is really in the trenches.
Mhm.
Mm,
It's in I call it the digital ditch digging that needs to happen, because the processes and information are not there. So it might seem mundane to parse an invoice, or it might seem mundane to do latitude and longitude geocoding in order to figure out relationships between organizations, so that you can then run it through an LLM and ask things. That might seem boring, but that's actually where most of the value is, and that's why agents have really taken off, is because that's where it's at
We're
from a
we're
value.
definitely seeing this. We're definitely seeing this too, Brian, as with across clients. Like a lot of people assume that it's just the hype that is driving, initiatives around AI. But your point around shadow AI is so true. It's just like this is happening. This is happening within the organizations, and adjustments to process, to how people respond to these, to
Mhm.
all of that need to be made. So it's not just hype. It's like it's here, and it's in people's hands.
Yeah.
yeah, and we can. I think it sounds like US organisations are struggling with some of the same things that we see in New Zealand and Australia too. But let's, if we kind of look now more towards that last mile, and I guess there are some assumptions there in terms of that these challenges can be overcome in terms of getting data into the right shape and in the right place, and joined up in the right way. But what opportunities do you see for organizations? Like what does the next couple of years look like in terms of what might be available to organizations and people in them?
Yeah, I think about it in terms of the gap between knowing and doing, or the gap between having data and actioning it. You've always heard, data is the most valuable resource. It's about taking action and insight, actionable intelligence, all those things. But when you have a generative component to this, it's not about bottling up the numbers and putting it in a chart. It's about having context and objective context. So, for example, what are our sales results, and how do our sales results last week compared to this week? That type of question is really well done in a dashboard. And so the challenge is that many times the dashboards, 30 to 60 days removed, it's hard to get that quote unquote real time. And so, does AI get rid of a dashboard? No. Does AI get rid of a process? Probably not. I mean, these things aren't going away. But what it does do is it decreases the complexity, and it decreases the burden of taking action, and it gives you a way to think things through faster. So most people think about AI as an output creator and thinking for you. But companies today that are moving fast in this bottom of the organization, where the tactical work is, they're thinking about it in terms of how do you provide people better inputs. Not can you do it for them, but can you give them better inputs? So could we structure things up better? Could we synthesize across data points faster? Could we equip our product team with something that they could give to engineering, and have engineering ask a bot before they have to get in a meeting, to try to help people be successful and remove that gap between, hey, I have a question, can we get on a call? And more importantly, moving everything out of just Slack conversations, where it's really hard to do deep work when you're slacking with people.
Mhm.
One, and then two, it's really hard to collaborate meaningfully via Teams or Slack or whatever. It's you got to do some deep work at some point. So that's where I think organizations are heading, is creating these speed layers, I call them, that decrease the gap between the knowing and the doing, and the data and the action of it. But more importantly, providing that generative component that brings in the data, does something with it, and converts it into something that that gives you that lens, and you're comfortable with that lens because you know where the data came from, and you don't have to necessarily figure it out yourself. So it's served up for you as an input that you can trust. And if you can start thinking about the inputs you get and get more of them, and then you're able to make a better decision. So as opposed to outsourcing work to the AI army, think about it as, what if you had a room full of the smartest people in the world who had a different perspective about your problem? How would you go about that?
Yeah, that's a great
And
insight.
in a way, you're saying that it's reducing the friction and increasing the accessibility of relevant information for people, so that
Mhm.
within the organization. So I guess that's increasing who could make decisions and things like that as well.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I know that in today, before AI, yeah, I call it before Chat GPT. So BC AC. That line in the sand. If you look at it before Chat GPT or before AI, you were really in a spot where you did your thing, and you were expert at it, and you went deep, and that's what you were known for. And that's certainly how I was. Certain areas went deep in. I got my PhD, and I was an expert on very narrow things. But now in today's after ChatGPT world, it's more about the people who can connect the dots, and
Mm,
that are not afraid of having that much information at their fingertips.
yeah.
So when you look at that last mile, then it's about how do you equip them with the information about your company? How do you help them ask those questions that perhaps they've been struggling to ask for years, or maybe even afraid to ask for years, or didn't even have the ability to ask for years because it would have required a 3-year wait, to get in front of somebody to ask for the dashboard type of thing, or you had to put a ticket in and never heard back, or
Yeah.
whatever.
Yeah.
So if you're able to say, look, we know where our data is coming from, and at least you can engage, and everybody's busy, so collaborate with our AI friend, our AI bot, and at least get unstuck. You don't really have an excuse to stay stuck if you look at it that way.
Yeah. It's
Do you
such
have to do
a
everything it says? No, you don't have to do everything it says, but you don't have to sit there and wonder what to do until 9 o'clock in the morning or whatever.
yeah. And I mean, you just start to see, I mean, AI is such a broad term, isn't it? And thinking about applying AI to the way you deliver work internally, but then, across your, improving your process, but then also and potentially in the products that you produce for customers. But just it's interesting, the threads that you've just been talking about in terms of all of the places within a business process that you can apply AI to even get the data into a better shape, so that then the broader, more aggregated views at the end, the last mile, become more and more valuable. But yeah, tell us a little bit more about I mean, obviously there's natural language query and text to SQL and those types of approaches. What does that empower people to do?
Yeah. So if you think about it, AI as really a capability, like a muscle, if you will, or a value contributor, as opposed to just a interface and a task or a tool. If you think of it as a capability and as a muscle, what kind of capability is it? Some would say, well, it's an email writer, or some would say it's a proofreader, or some would say it's something I use when I need to write a nice letter to my wife. I don't know, right? They think of it in terms of that task. But if you think about it in terms of a capability, what is it taking in, and what is it providing out, and how consistent is it? And then what are you getting out of it? You probably would end up in the space of it's got brain power, and it's got compute. That's why these data centers are so popping up everywhere, and so much money is being spent on it, is because that brain power, if you will. And when you start scratching the surface of what that actually is happening, in the hardware and in the chips to make all this happen. It's pretty phenomenal. And then also, the more you get into understanding how it all works, the more you realize that it's not going to necessarily wake up in the morning, and turn your toaster into something that's trying to kill you. Like, it's just not going to do that. right. And the more you explore how it works, the more you realize that's not going to happen. So the idea that then, okay, it's a capability, it's got compute, it's a bit of a brain. What's the brain? And if you're an organic kind of person, you think organically as a system, that brain needs good brain food, right? It doesn't need junk food. You don't want to give it junk food. You want to give it good food. Well, what is that? It's the data and information. So when you think about it that way, it becomes an ecosystem powered by this capability, and then you can do a lot of different things with it. So you can do it at a task level, which everybody's playing with now. You can do it at a project level, and then an initiative level. And you can think about it as a sidecar to other capabilities and building out these networks and things. So when you look at it that way, the idea then that you have this capability that's a bit untapped because you don't understand it, what kind of innovation and what kind of experiments do you want to run, honestly, right? And I think that's the biggest issue in all of this right now, is when you first look at a chat bot window, what is that moment of hesitation? What are you going to do in that window? Do you even know what to ask? And then when you think about it as a capability, what are you going to do to innovate? And how are you going to use this to perhaps create a new product that you didn't know you could 2 years ago? And then you could start getting into this third space, which is, hey, there's business people like Brian Lambert who tried to learn how to code 5 years ago and gave up. That within 3 years has launched 3 enterprise apps by himself with an AI coding tool, and no Jira tickets. So now what?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, right? So what is going to happen to the people talking about beyond agile, or just what happens to team structures, and what are you seeing in the US with organizations? I know you've mentioned forward deployed engineers before. What sort of patterns are emerging there?
Yeah, so that's a great question, and really, really fascinating when you get into the human aspect of this, because we're experts at very specific things. We're siloed by nature before the chatbot, and interestingly enough, the things that we try to sell, the products we try to bring to market, they're usually broader and they're determined more valuable because they're able to solve a problem or they're able to drive an outcome. And when you start thinking about an outcome or a problem to solve, it's really hard to get it to your specific skill set. So in other words, everybody's a puzzle piece in the grander scheme of solving an outcome before AI. With AI, guess what? AI doesn't care what your silo is.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this is a big challenge that people have with adoption on the human side. Well, I went and asked the chatbot some things, and it basically told me to get outside of my job, and it's not my job to do these things. And oh, by the way, if I did those things, I would get written up. So this is all dangerous, because now it's asking me to get outside my department and get outside my job, and I'm in my comfort zone of doing my job, and I don't even know what to do now. So I'm out. I'm out of this whole AI thing. So then you say, okay, well, what's the organizational structure now? Because the organizational structure is predicated on everybody getting in a box and doing their job. And now you have customers who don't care what your org chart is, and you have this AI capability brain that has all this compute power. And guess what? It doesn't care about your org chart either. It wants results and outcomes. And so what's the limiting factor in that whole equation is mindset and change. and that's the number one thing that we're seeing. So what you end up with is a decision to make. If you're gonna deploy all this technology and nobody's going to use it, then what do you do? Because everybody around you as an executive is using it. So you're going to go with the Microsoft Copilots. You're going to go with all that. You got to do that. It's table stakes. You got to do their AI stuff, but you're not going to see the productivity gains because it's all in their silo. So you can productivize. You can be productive in your silo, but stay in your box.
Yeah.
So that the opposite of that is, hey, I'm going to create an innovation team, an innovation pod. I'm going to give them, $5,000 a month in cursor credits in 90 days, and I'm just going to leave them alone, and they can break all the rules they want. And I just want to see if we can get a prototype.
Yeah.
That is happening, and nobody's talking about it. But it is definitely happening, one. And then two, the people who can work that way are getting snatched up, and they're not talking about it either because they're making lots of money or whatever. Because that mindset to be able to pursue an outcome and just tinker, and also to get outside your comfort zone and have new skills. And it's the ability to learn in that way, and then not be afraid to show somebody a work in progress. So what's the org chart for that? Right.
Yeah.
And the org chart for that is not command and control, which, by the way, because that's my background. I was in the military and stuff. Not that I'm an expert, but when you're fearful and you're not sure, what do? Is you hunker down. And so people are hunkering down in their org chart jobs and waiting for the shoe to drop, so to speak. On the other side, there's this renegade group that's like, yeah, no rules anymore. I'm going to go prototype something and see where it goes. So that's the big, the big picture. And if you think about it, okay, well, that makes sense, or whatever, he's rambling. You think about it from if you're history buff, in Italy, at a certain point in time that became known as the Renaissance, this phenomenon actually unfolded as well. It just took a lot longer, but it was in the crossroads, and in the all of these convergences of different perspectives and lack of structure and innovation and creativity that led to many different breakthroughs. And it wasn't because they had a great org chart. So that's what's happening now. There's a new renaissance upon us. And that new renaissance is embracing the new reality. And unfortunately, for most organizations, the structure that they've set up doesn't like that, right?
It's
It's
interesting, isn't
not
it?
compatible.
Yeah. I mean, I think those tensions have always been in organizations. How do you introduce innovation? Innovation is different people thrive in different environments, like you say. Some people love to explore and learn. Other people love to scale and create structure and make things work in a really reliable way. And people are comfortable in different places. But this just sort of accelerates that whole process, right? And the fact that an individual can now span such a broad set of capabilities. So smaller teams are capable of doing, working faster and producing right across the kind of the life cycle. And so I think the tension it does kind of lift the tension in terms of how do you get those kind of groups working together within an organization, and the network side with innovation versus the hierarchical side for stability. But it's I think the challenge has always been there, but now it's really coming to the forefront.
Yeah.
So any advice for organizations? Like what are the things to do? Like innovation, I think all organizations want it, but the consequence of it could create this tension. I mean, what advice do you give organizations to explore, but to do it in a way that helps people work together?
Yeah, I think for me, I mean, for me, there's different perspectives on that. I think everybody, to me, the number one thing is everybody's got to get more curious. The amount of assumptions that are being made and the amount of just knee-jerk reaction on anything abnormal it's just really hypersensitive. So when you kind of stick your head up and try to do something different, and the whole ecosystem, smacks you within a millisecond, that leads to a lot of aversion and apathy, and people, just want to get back to their 9 to 5. And so to me, it's the idea that if you're able to ask the question and slow down for a second and get to the root cause, and that's my advice, is just get back to the idea of asking why, more, or what do you think, instead of asking when's it going to be done and what's the answer. Those are kind of two different paradigms. When's it going to be done? When's it going to be done? What's the answer? What's the answer? If you're in a spot for the receiving end of that for 8 hours a day, it really gets you anxious. On the other side of it, if you're in the, hey, what happened here, and why did it happen, and let's diagnose this a little bit, and let's figure out how to do it better, which one's more valuable, and which one's more valuable to your customers. And I think that's really the question that people have. And so do you either reward curiosity, or do you stamp it out? And I think most people believe that they're advocates of the curious, and they're curious themselves, but really they're not. They just tell you what to do, and expect the answer, as opposed to realizing the time that we're in requires a little bit of brain power, that human in the loop.
This resonates a lot with what we're seeing, and we're seeing the full spectrum. There's organizations that are doing the AI mandates, but at the same time, people are being smacked down, if they're stepping outside their boxes. So that combination doesn't work. But then, there are obviously other types of leadership that are, being a bit more curious and keen to see people using evidence for decision making, and encouraging, breaking down some of the walls. And then from the individual point of view, people being curious and brave and trying things and doing those proof of concepts that you were talking about. So yeah, it's and we're seeing everything in between as well. There's the full spectrum of this. It's a very interesting time, isn't it?
Well, there's a lot of talk about natural language query in the industry. Can you just sort of explain to folks what does that mean, Brian, and what tools are you seeing people use for that?
Yeah, sure. Well, you just did it right there. You asked me a question. So it's using your natural language. It's just how you speak and how you talk, right? So the idea of being curious is really a critical capability that most people need to get back in touch with, and learn how to ask questions. And I think that's really an interesting way to look at it, right? So you can actually use chat bots. You can actually use the simple interface to just be yourself, and that's what natural language queries are. And there's no coding, there's no SQL query. I mean, you can do that, and there's really no preconceived filters, if you will. When you do that, you just ask for what you need. You ask that question, and you get an answer back. And one of the things that Queris does in that regard is actually leverage that natural language in a way that can not only interact with documents, but actually raw data, and then bring it back and give you things to think about, and also connect dots. And an example of that, because I like to think about, okay, well, that's a great idea. Can't you do that in a chat GPT, or can't you just do that in a, on your phone? Every chat bot can do that. But one of the things that's really important to realize is that not every chat bot has your company's context and your company's information and data. in it. And in fact, you should hope that it doesn't have it. So with Queris, it's this idea that natural language is a gateway to exploration. So, I have a sales background, and I can just ask it, what were the sales, from the West region, what happened last week, and what's the customer feedback? What did we see in our chatbot last week? And ask it, do you see any correlation there? Is there anything I need to look into? You can also ask it, hey, what questions do you have about it? So this is the idea that AI, it becomes an input for you. It helps you think things through, which is really a lost art in many organizations, where folks are really in a cadence in a tempo of doing, as opposed to thinking things through. So with Queris, you're able to leverage your own filters and your own data and your own information, with the way that you talk, with that natural language, to figure out what to do, and really remove that moment of hesitation that can get in the way of taking action. And we like to say that, you need to own the moment. When you ask that question, be happy to hit enter, own that question, and be glad you asked it. And that's what we want people to feel when they're using the platform.
And what's coming back? So is the agent making some choices about how to visualize the data, what analysis to put on it, all of the above?
Mhm. Oh, all kinds of things will come back. But yeah, like charts and text, and you can filter it. You can do what we call pin it. You can put it up into a chart. You can collaborate with it, and more importantly, invite others to do the same. Sometimes you want it to be a chart. Sometimes you want it to just be a conversation. So it's really up to you. And we want to enable you to figure that out, and to give you these tools so that you can find the best representation of your question, in the format that really helps you think things through, and invite others to do that. So that's really what the platform is built around. Not just a simple, give me an answer, give me an output, but really asking that question so that you can be a more informed decision maker and leader, and more importantly, have the confidence that you need to start calling others in to that conversation, or more importantly, to take that action, because you got that information.
That makes a whole lot of sense. So it's combining. It's not like dashboards go away; that they serve a particular purpose, but then it's that addition of natural language query to give you both of those powerful kind of, the here are my KPIs, am I meeting them? Those are the things I need to track regularly. But then how do I actually interrogate the data without having to ask someone else to write some SQL or write a report for me? And getting people interacting, citizen development, sometimes people call it, but getting people to interact with the data in ways that they haven't been able to before. But yeah, it is an exciting time. But I think we're just about drawing to a close. But we've covered a huge amount of territory today. So maybe, should we try and summarize some of the kind of main ideas? Daniel, that's usually you're pretty good at this.
Yeah, we covered a lot, so you've thrown me a pretty big challenge. So I mean, we started with a bit of Brian's background, and I think it's similar to a bit of yourself and myself, Gareth, in terms of we've been involved in data, but also machine learning and other aspects. But as the last few years have gone through, we've started to realize that generative AI in particular is going to be disruptive in a lot of different ways, and therefore, there was things to learn, and that was interesting for us. But it was also, being lifelong learners, we're like, if we're going to stay relevant, and the pursuit of relevance is a key value of Hyper, then we need to explore what's possible. And I mean, what we've discovered is possible with these technologies is really out there. You you then talked about some of the challenges within organizations, the importance of, having good data quality and accessible data. So it was, I think you described it as the brain food for AIs. So I really like that analogy.
Yeah,
And
I love the
yeah.
organic references as well. I think that's a really important thing, like moving away from the mechanical reductionist view of the world to, statistical and organic sort of metaphors. So yeah, really powerful. And data drag we touched on. I love that phrase. I think that's your phrase, Brian. It just sums up what we see in organizations really nicely. It's hard, right? Organizing, categorizing, curating, adding semantic meaning to data from many different sources, and then organizing it into data products is non-trivial, right?
Right. Yeah, and then all of it has to come together. It's to me in that last mile, that idea that all of that can be harnessed to do something valuable, and looking at it as an input instead of outsourcing work to it. If you use it as an input source, there's a lot you can do with it, and that means you have to get curious and not be afraid to ask those questions. And AI has come a long way in the last year and a half with natural language, and the idea that you can use your own internal content and information as context, which I think is now going to become even more a competitive advantage as companies move forward.
Yeah, and then I think the last thing we sort of touched on was the impact on organizational structures, and how do you innovate with these amazing new tools in a way that can live in the organization with healthy interactions with the rest of the organization. I think that's definitely an evolving topic, isn't it? AI, team-based AI interaction patterns, and then the organizational structures that support that. But yeah, fascinating stuff. Well, I think that's that's us for today. But thank you so much, Brian. Fantastic kind of broad topics we've covered, and really love hearing from people outside of New Zealand and Australia. I think offers us really new, interesting perspectives as well. And obviously, you've been involved in this space for a long time. So thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you.
Brian.
Appreciate the conversation. Yeah, it was great. We'll see you next time.
Thanks a lot.